Michael Caine sat silently in the back row of the crowded city bus, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, giving the impression of a man trying to take up less space than his imposing 6'3" frame demanded. His military green jacket, faded and frayed at the edges, clung tightly to his solid build, and a subtle Marine Corps insignia peeked out near the collar. His face, weathered by time and unseen battles, bore a quiet strength. A scar that ran diagonally across his temple to his jaw told its own story, though no one ever asked. His expression was calm but distant, as though he were physically present but mentally elsewhere. The bus jolted to a stop at an intersection, the hiss of air brakes pulling Michael back into the moment. Round him, the hum of mundane life unfolded. A young woman in the business attire was tapping furiously on her phone, her earbuds drowning out the world. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a mechanic's uniform was flipping through an auto parts catalog, his lips moving silently as he read. Toward the front, a group of teenagers laughed too loudly, their carefree banter occasionally drawing annoyed glances from other passengers. Michael glanced out the window at the bustling street. Vendors shouted at passers-by from makeshift stands. A bicyclist zipped between cars, narrowly avoiding a horn blast from a frustrated driver. The city thrived with an energy Michael found both fascinating and exhausting. To the untrained eye, Michael might seem like just another tired face blending into the backdrop of the city. But for those who looked closer, though few ever did, there was a tension in his demeanor, a coiled readiness that suggested a man who had seen too much and couldn't quite let it go. "Who's this guy?" a teenage boy muttered to his friend, nodding subtly toward Michael. The boy's voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for Michael's sharp ears to catch. "Dunno," the friend replied, stealing a glance. "Looks like some ex-soldier or something. Washed up, maybe." Michael didn't react. He'd heard worse. Over the years, he'd become a master of quiet endurance. He shifted slightly, his knee aching, a familiar pain from an old injury that flared up whenever he sat for too long. The bus continued its route, stopping every few blocks to let passengers on and off. Michael watched each new face with practiced precision, a habit from his years in the service that he couldn't quite break. He noted the way people moved, their expressions, their body language. Most were harmless, a mother with a stroller, a man carrying grocery bags, but one caught his attention. A man in his 30s stepped on, his shoulders slightly hunched under a black hoodie. He carried himself with a restless energy, his eyes darting around the bus before settling on an empty seat near the middle. Michael's instincts stirred. The man's movements were subtle but deliberate, like he was casing the scene. Michael's jaw tightened. It was probably nothing, but the itch in the back of his mind told him otherwise. 2 stops later, another man boarded, this one stockier, his bald head gleaming under the harsh bus lights. He exchanged a quick glance with the first man, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. Michael saw it immediately. A silent communication, a flicker of understanding between two people who didn't want to be noticed. Michael shifted in his seat, his senses sharpening. Years of training came flooding back unbidden, his body preparing for something his mind hadn't yet fully acknowledged. He scanned the bus again, taking note of the exits, the distance between him and the men, and the positions of the other passengers. The mechanic was still absorbed in his catalog. The teenagers were too busy laughing to notice anything out of the ordinary. The young woman near the front was oblivious, her attention glued to her phone. No one else seemed to sense the subtle shift in the air. Michael's gaze returned to the 2 men. The stockier one stood, moving down the aisle with the casual air of someone stretching his legs, but his eyes roved too much, taking in the passengers one by one. He stopped near the back, just a few rows ahead of Michael, and leaned against a pole. The man in the hoodie remained seated, his hand slipping into his jacket pocket. Michael caught the faintest glimpse of something metallic, a knife, maybe, or the edge of a gun. His pulse quickened, but his expression didn't change. He stayed still, watching, waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," the stocky man said suddenly, his voice loud and commanding. The bus fell silent. Even the teenagers stopped laughing. "We're going to make this quick and easy. Hand over your wallets, Phones, jewelry, whatever you've got, and no one gets hurt." The young woman gasped audibly, clutching her purse. The mechanic froze, his catalog slipping from his hands and landing on the floor. The teenagers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado replaced with fear. Michael stayed motionless, his mind racing. The man in the hoodie stood, pulling a handgun from his pocket and waving it lazily toward the passengers. "Let's go," he said, his tone sharp. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The stocky man moved down the aisle, holding a bag open and glaring at anyone who hesitated. He stopped in front of the young woman, who fumbled with her purse, her hands trembling. Michael's muscles tensed. He measured the distance between himself and the men, calculating his next move. He knew he had only one chance to act, and that it had to be precise. His fingers tightened around the edge of his seat, ready to spring into action. "Stay calm," Michael whispered to himself, the words barely audible. His breathing steadied, his focus narrowing. The stocky man turned his attention to the teenagers, barking orders as they scrambled to empty their pockets. Michael waited, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. He didn't know if he could pull this off, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just sit there and watch. Michael sat rigidly, his sharp gaze tracking every movement of the two men. The stocky one was methodical, working his way down the aisle, snatching wallets, phones, and purses with mechanical efficiency. The man in the hoodie hung back, his handgun leveled lazily at the passengers, but his eyes flitted nervously, betraying his inexperience. Michael's instincts were in overdrive, his mind processing details at lightning speed. The stocky man's dominant hand, the distance to the gunman, the lack of cover in the cramped bus, all of it painted a clear picture of what needed to happen and how slim his margin for error was. "Move it along," barked the man with the gun, his voice sharp and cracking slightly. "We don't have all day." The stocky man stopped at the row in front of Michael, looming over an elderly man clutching his briefcase. The older passenger looked terrified, his knuckles white against the worn leather handle. "Come on, Pops," the man growled, his patience wearing thin. "Hand it over before I lose my temper." The elderly man stammered, his trembling hands struggling to release the clasp of his case. The delay drew a sneer from the stocky man, who reached out to yank it away. Michael's hand twitched, but he held back. Not yet. The gunman stepped forward, his weapon now angled slightly toward the back of the bus. Michael's window of opportunity was shrinking. "Hey!" the gunman snapped, jerking his weapon toward the stocky man. "Hurry up!" Michael inhaled deeply, a habit he'd developed long ago to steady his nerves. In that single breath, he made his decision. The stocky man tore the briefcase from the old man's hands with a triumphant grunt. As he turned to toss it into the bag slung over his shoulder, Michael surged to his feet. The motion was swift, almost silent, but it was enough to catch the gunman's attention. "Sit down," the gunman shouted, leveling his weapon at Michael, but Michael was already moving. With the precision of someone who had drilled these maneuvers 1,000 times, Michael grabbed the pole beside him and used it to pivot, his booted foot striking the stocky man squarely in the chest. The force sent him crashing backward into the aisle, the stolen briefcase and bag clattering to the floor. The gunman's eyes widened in shock, but he recovered quickly, adjusting his aim toward Michael. Before he could pull the trigger, Michael closed the gap, his hand lashing out to grip the gunman's wrist. He twisted sharply, forcing the weapon upward just as it fired, the deafening crack reverberating through the bus. Passengers screamed, ducking down into their seats. The bullet punched harmlessly into the ceiling, showering plaster dust onto the seats below. Michael didn't let up, his grip like a vice as he forced the man's arm downward. With a calculated sweep of his leg, Michael sent the gunman sprawling to the floor. The stocky man groaned from his position near the back, scrambling to regain his footing. Michael kicked the discarded briefcase toward the elderly man, his eyes never leaving the assailants. "Stay down," Michael barked, his voice commanding and firm. The stocky man growled, his face twisted with anger. He reached into his jacket, producing a knife, the blade glinting ominously under the flickering bus lights. Michael's heart raced, but his mind remained focused. The gunman was still on the floor, clutching his wrist and groaning in pain. The knife-wielding man, however, was regaining his composure, his stance widening as he prepared to attack. The bus lurched suddenly as the driver, oblivious to the chaos, took a sharp corner. The momentum threw the stocky man off balance, and Michael seized the opening. He stepped forward, delivering a brutal punch to the man's midsection, followed by an elbow to the jaw. The knife clattered to the floor as the man crumpled, gasping for air. Michael kicked the knife across the aisle, far out of reach, and turned back toward the gunman. The younger man was scrambling toward his weapon, which had skidded under a nearby seat during the struggle. Michael lunged forward, gripping the back of the man's jacket and hauling him upright. "Enough," Michael growled, his voice low and cold. The gunman whimpered, his earlier bravado replaced by fear. Michael slammed him into the side panel of the bus, pinning him with a forearm across his chest. The younger man's weapon clattered to the floor once more, out of reach. By now, the passengers were beginning to stir, their stunned silence giving way to murmurs of shock and disbelief. Michael glanced over his shoulder, his voice sharp but steady. "Someone get the driver. Tell them to stop the bus and call the police." The young woman near the front nodded shakily, fumbling with her phone as she made her way toward the driver. The elderly man clutched his briefcase tightly, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and gratitude. The bus screeched to a halt, the sudden stop jolting everyone forward. Michael kept his grip on the gunman, his eyes scanning the scene for any remaining threats. The stocky man lay motionless near the back, groaning softly, while the gunman remained pinned against the side panel, too terrified to resist. The sound of distant sirens grew louder, cutting through the tense silence like a lifeline. The passengers began to relax, their panic slowly ebbing as the realization sank in. They were safe. Michael exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. But even as the immediate danger passed, he couldn't shake the familiar weight settling over him, a mix of exhaustion and unease. The sirens grew louder still until flashing red and blue lights illuminated the interior of the bus. Michael released the gunman, who slumped to the floor, his hands raised in surrender. As police officers swarmed the scene, Michael stepped back, his expression unreadable. The passengers watched him with wide eyes, their whispers barely audible over the commotion. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "Did you see what he just did?" another asked. Michael ignored the voices, his focus fixed on the flashing lights outside. For years, he'd tried to fade into the background, to live a life defined by simplicity and quiet. But tonight, the shadows he'd worked so hard to hide in had cast him into the spotlight, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. Michael leaned against the side of the bus, the cold metal pressing into his back as the police officers swarmed the scene. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the street in an almost surreal glow. The noise was deafening, radios crackling, officers barking orders, and passengers frantically explaining what had happened. Despite the chaos around him, Michael remained silent, his eyes scanning the scene for loose ends, an old habit he couldn't shake. The two attackers were cuffed and dragged out of the bus, the stocky man wincing in pain as he was shoved into the back of a police cruiser. His accomplice, the younger gunman, stumbled along, his head hung low, muttering curses under his breath. Michael watched them leave without a trace of satisfaction. He had neutralized the threat. That's all this had been, nothing more. "Sir, can you step forward?" A voice cut through the noise, authoritative but calm. Michael turned to see a tall detective with salt and pepper hair and sharp, probing eyes. His badge glinted under the flashing lights as he gestured for Michael to join him. Michael hesitated but eventually pushed himself off the bus wall and approached. "What's your name?" the detective asked, his pen poised over a notepad. "Michael Kane," he replied, his voice steady but low. "All right, Mr. Kane," the detective said, his tone both curious and professional. "Mind telling me what happened here?" Michael shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest. "Two men boarded the bus, armed. They started robbing passengers. I intervened." The detective raised an eyebrow. "Intervened? From what I hear, you didn't just intervene, you disarmed one, took down the other, and stopped them from hurting anyone. That's quite a feat." Michael didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked to the ground, his jaw tightening. "I did what I had to," he said finally, the words clipped. The detective studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to piece together Michael's story. "Military?" he asked. Michael nodded. "Marine Corps, retired." The detective let out a low whistle. "That explains a lot. You handled this like a pro. Most people would have frozen, or worse, escalated the situation. You kept everyone safe." Michael's jaw tightened further. He didn't feel like a hero, and he didn't want to be labeled as one. "They had a gun pointed at a child," he said simply. "It wasn't a choice." Before the detective could respond, one of the officers approached, holding a confiscated weapon. "This was loaded," he said grimly. "Serial numbers filed off." The detective's expression hardened. "You saved a lot of lives tonight," he said to Michael, "whether you want to admit it or not." Michael said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. He glanced back at the bus, where the passengers were now filing out, their faces a mixture of fear and relief. Whispers floated through the air. "That guy. He's the reason we're still alive. Did you see how fast he moved? Who is he?" Michael felt their eyes on him, their murmurs growing louder as they realized he was the man who had stopped the attack. He turned away, his shoulders stiffening. He didn't want their gratitude, their awe. He just wanted to go home. The detective wasn't done. "One more thing, Mr. Kane," he said, stepping closer. "We're going to need a detailed statement. You're not in trouble, far from it. But with all these witnesses and the circumstances, we need everything on record." Michael nodded curtly. "I'll cooperate." As the detective led him to a quieter corner of the scene, Michael could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes following him. Their gratitude felt like a spotlight he couldn't escape, and he hated it. He wasn't a hero, he was just a man who had done what was necessary. That didn't make him special. By the time Michael finished giving his statement, the commotion had started to die down. The bus was cordoned off with yellow tape, and the remaining passengers were being escorted away by police. Michael adjusted the collar of his jacket, preparing to slip away unnoticed. But fate had other plans. "Hey, that's him!" a voice called out from nearby. Michael turned, his heart sinking. A young man in his 20s was holding up a phone, pointing it at him. "You're the guy who took them down," the man said excitedly. "It's all over the internet. Someone filmed the whole thing." Michael's stomach churned. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low. The man turned his phone around, showing Michael the screen. A grainy video played, capturing the exact moment Michael had disarmed the gunman and neutralized the stocky attacker. The video cut to passengers cowering in awe as Michael took control of the situation. It was raw, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. "It's going viral, man," the young man continued. "Everyone's calling you the bus hero. You're all over social media." Michael felt a wave of unease wash over him. This wasn't what he wanted. He had spent years avoiding attention, trying to live quietly, away from the chaos of his past. Now, in the span of a single night, his face and actions were plastered across the internet. "Delete it," Michael said firmly, though he knew it was futile. The video was already out there, spreading faster than he could control. The young man gave him an apologetic shrug. "Too late for that. People are already talking about you." Michael pulled his jacket tighter around him, his expression darkening. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him into the shadows of the nearby streets. As he navigated the dimly lit streets back to his apartment, Michael's mind raced. The faces of the passengers flashed before him, their fear, their relief, their gratitude. He could still hear their whispers, their thanks, their murmurs of awe. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted it. When he finally reached his building, he climbed the stairs 2 at a time, shutting the door behind him with a heavy sigh. The small apartment was as unremarkable as ever, a single chair, a worn couch, and a table cluttered with papers and a few unopened letters. He collapsed into the chair, running a hand over his face. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. Finally, with a groan, he picked it up. Notifications flooded the screen. Messages, missed calls, social media tags. The words blurred together, but one phrase kept jumping out. Hero saves passengers. Michael tossed the phone onto the table, letting it clatter against the wood. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. They didn't know him. They didn't know the things he had done, the choices he had made. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had done what anyone in his position would have done. At least, that's what he told himself. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Michael Caine sat on the edge of his worn couch, staring at the buzzing phone on the cluttered table in front of him. The screen lit up with another notification, the words flashing like an accusation. Hero of the bus hijacking. Michael Caine identified as retired Marine. His name was now attached to a story he had no control over, and the world was quickly making it their own. The weight of unwanted recognition bore down on him. He didn't want the calls, the messages, or the praise. He didn't want to be a hero. His apartment, usually a refuge, now felt suffocating. He stood abruptly, his hands clenching and unclenching as he paced the small space. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city filtered through the thin walls, but inside, his thoughts roared. The phone buzzed again, louder this time. Or maybe it was just his imagination. Michael grabbed it, intending to turn it off, but his hand hesitated. The name on the screen stopped him cold. Detective Carter. Reluctantly, Michael answered, his voice gruff. Caine. Mr. Caine, it's Detective Carter, came the measured tone of the man he'd spoken to at the scene. I know you didn't ask for this attention, but I thought you'd want to know. Those men you stopped, they're connected to a larger criminal operation. Michael's brows furrowed. What kind of operation? Smuggling, arms deals, extortion. They've been on our radar for months. The two you stopped were small players, but they're part of a much bigger network. We think your actions disrupted their plans. Temporarily, at least. Michael's grip tightened on the phone. And now I'm a target. Carter hesitated. We don't have any concrete evidence to suggest that, but it's possible. These kinds of people don't like being humiliated, especially not on the news. Michael exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He could feel the old instincts kicking in, the parts of him he'd tried to bury. Assess the threat. Prepare for the worst. Anything else I should know? Michael asked, his tone clipped. Carter paused before replying. Just be careful. You handled yourself well on that bus, but this isn't over. If you notice anything out of the ordinary, call me. Michael didn't respond immediately. He ended the call with a curt, thanks, and tossed the phone back onto the table. As Michael stood by the window, looking out at the chaotic city below, memories began to surface. Memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. He was back in the desert, the sun blazing overhead as his unit moved through the crumbling remains of a war-torn village. Their mission was to extract a local informant who had critical intelligence, but the operation had gone sideways. "Stay low," barked his commanding officer, but Michael had already broken cover, his instincts overriding orders. He remembered the heat of the firefight, the cacophony of gunfire, and the moment he saw his best friend, Sergeant James Porter, fall. Michael had pulled him to safety, but it was too late. Porter's last words still echoed in his mind. "Get them home, Mike. That's an order." He had fulfilled that order, but at a cost. He'd carried the guilt of that day with him ever since, a constant weight on his shoulders. Porter's death had been the catalyst for his decision to leave the military. He couldn't face another mission, another failure. Michael's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was sharp, insistent, and immediately put him on edge. He wasn't expecting anyone. Crossing the room silently, he peeked through the peephole. A young man in a cheap suit stood on the other side, holding a tablet. His expression was eager, almost too eager. Michael opened the door just enough to see him clearly. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cold. "Mr. Caine, I'm from Channel 7 News. My name's Ryan Jacobs." The man held up his press badge as if it were a golden ticket. "We'd love to get an exclusive interview with you about what happened on the bus. The public is dying to know more about the bus hero." Michael's jaw tightened. "Not interested," he said flatly, and began to close the door. "Wait," Ryan blurted, stepping forward slightly. "Just a few questions. People want to hear your story. What made you step up? Your background in the Marines? Your perspective on—" Michael slammed the door shut, cutting off the reporter mid-sentence. He leaned against the door, his breathing heavy. The last thing he wanted was to have his life turned into a spectacle. Michael returned to the couch, his mind racing. The detective's warning lingered. If those men were part of something bigger, how long would it take for their associates to come looking for him? And what about the media? Every story, every interview request, every viral video made it easier for someone to find him. He needed to stay ahead of it. Reaching for his duffel bag, Michael began to sort through its contents. Inside were remnants of his old life, practical gear, mementos from his service, and a pistol he'd hoped he'd never have to use again. He checked the weapon, ensuring it was clean and operational, before tucking it away. As he worked, his mind sharpened. He began mapping out potential scenarios, fallback plans, and escape routes. He didn't want trouble, but if it came, he'd be ready. Later that evening, as Michael sat by the window with a cup of coffee, something caught his attention. Across the street, a black sedan idled near the curb, its engine running. It had been there for nearly an hour. Michael's eyes narrowed. The car didn't belong to any of his neighbors. He knew every vehicle on this block, and this one was out of place. He watched as the driver lit a cigarette, the glow of the lighter briefly illuminating his face. Michael's instincts flared. Was this the retaliation Detective Carter had warned him about, or just a coincidence? The car eventually pulled away, but the unease lingered. Michael knew one thing for sure. His quiet, reclusive life was over. Michael Caine stood in the dim light of his apartment, his jaw tight as he peered through the curtains. The black sedan had returned, idling in the same spot across the street. This time, the driver wasn't alone. A second man, bulkier and wearing a hood, leaned casually against the passenger door, scanning the area. Michael knew this wasn't a coincidence. Detective Carter's warning echoed in his mind. They don't like being humiliated. He grabbed his phone and dialed Carter's number. "It's Caine," he said when the line connected. "They're here." Carter promised to send officers, but Michael knew he couldn't wait. The men across the street weren't here to scare him. They were here to send a message, and anyone caught in the crossfire wouldn't matter to them. Michael checked his pistol, the weight of the weapon unfamiliar but reassuring in his hand. He didn't want to use it, but he was prepared to. The men made their move moments later. The hooded figure crossed the street, his stride purposeful, while the sedan pulled into the alley beside Michael's building. Michael's heart pounded, but his focus sharpened. When the knock came at his door, it wasn't polite. It was loud, demanding. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he moved silently to the side, positioning himself where he had the advantage. The second knock was followed by a voice. "Mr. Caine," the hooded man called out. "We just want to talk. You made a lot of trouble for some important people, and they'd like to have a word." Michael didn't reply. The man tried the doorknob, but it didn't budge. A beat passed, then a loud crack as the door was kicked open. The hooded man stepped inside, but Michael was ready. In one swift motion, he disarmed the intruder, twisting the man's wrist until the weapon clattered to the floor. A sharp jab to the man's ribs sent him sprawling. The sound of footsteps in the alley alerted Michael to the second man. He moved quickly, shutting off the lights and taking cover near the window. The second man entered cautiously, his movements slower and more calculated. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the second man said, his voice cold. Michael responded with precision, stepping out of the shadows to knock the man's weapon from his hand. The ensuing scuffle was short but intense, ending with Michael pinning the intruder against the wall. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. Michael released the man and stepped back, his pistol still in hand. The intruders froze, realizing their time was up. Moments later, Carter and a team of officers burst into the apartment, guns drawn. The two men were quickly subdued and taken into custody. Carter approached Michael, his expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "You couldn't wait for us?" Carter asked, though his tone was more impressed than accusatory. Michael gave a small shrug. "Didn't have a choice." Carter sighed, shaking his head. You know, most people would have called it quits after the bus. You keep stepping in when no one else will. Why? Michael hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Because someone has to, he said quietly. In the days that followed, the story of Michael Caine grew. The arrest of the two intruders led to a larger investigation, uncovering the criminal network they were part of. Michael's role in dismantling the operation didn't go unnoticed, and the media latched onto his name once again. Despite the attention, Michael avoided the spotlight. He declined interviews, ignored reporters, and continued living in his small apartment. But something had shifted within him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a reminder that his skills, his training, and his experiences still mattered. One morning, Michael received a letter in the mail. It was from a local veterans organization inviting him to speak at a community event. At first, he considered tossing it aside, but something made him pause. The thought of connecting with others who had walked a similar path felt less daunting than it once had. A week later, Michael stood in front of a room filled with veterans and their families. He spoke honestly about his struggles, his doubts, and the moment he realized that being washed up didn't mean being useless. His words resonated, and for the first time he saw himself not as a broken man, but as someone who could make a difference. As Michael left the event, a young man approached him. "I saw the video of what you did on the bus," the man said, his voice filled with admiration. "It made me realize I don't have to be afraid to stand up for what's right. Thank you." Michael nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He walked into the sunlight, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He wasn't a hero, not in the way people thought, but he was finally at peace with who he was. And for the first time, that was enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want more content like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And we want to hear from you. What did you think of Michael Caine's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more inspiring and action-packed stories, and we'll see you in the next video.